It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Natalia Maglouf, who is our current Tinker Visiting Professor in the Center for Latin American Studies in the Department of Art History. Dr. Maglouf received her PhD in art history at the University of Texas at Austin, and subsequently served as curator and then director of the Museo de Arte de Lima for over 2 decades, during which time she significantly expanded the range and scope of those collections. And she also helped to curate several noteworthy exhibitions, including Sabogal in 2013, Jose Gil de Castro, Pintor de Libertadores in 2014-15, and the avant-garde networks of Amauta, Argentina, Mexico, and Peru in the 1920s. And that was just, I guess, last year now. She has been the recipient of several prestigious prizes and fellowships, including the Simon Bolivar Professorship at the University of Cambridge during the 2018-19 academic year, and fellowships from the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Getty Foundation. Dr. Maglouf has offered a number of important articles and catalog essays, many of which have been field-defining for the study of 19th century and modern Peruvian art. Today's talk will be drawn from her forthcoming book, Inventing Indigenism, Francisco Laso's Image of Modern Peru, which will be published by the University of Texas Press next month, I believe. And so this is something I'm very much looking forward to, and I hope you all have a chance to read. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Natalia.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for making all of this possible. I want to thank Natalie Arsenault too at class. What I am going to present today is actually very old work, and it is also very new work because, as Megan says, it's part of the new book I'm publishing with University of Texas Press, which is coming out over the next few days, hopefully. So it's a very, very heavily revised variant of what was at one point, many, many years ago, my doctoral dissertation. So I will begin with this photograph. In 1852, Peruvian painter Francisco Laso, who had trained under Charles Glare in the 1840s and recently returned to Europe after a brief stay in Peru, posed for a group photograph in Paris. In the image, the poet Manuel Nicolás Corpancho sets his right arm on Laso's shoulder and looks in his direction, while the painter Ignacio Merino leans forward and rests his weight on the small table in the middle. In their engaging attitudes, Merino and Corpancho galvanize the composition. Laso sits apart. His withdrawn, absorbed attitude and grave expression shape the artist's self-image as the melancholic, the romantic ideal of the solitary, alienated artist that marked his generation. Literary critics have questioned this despondent inclination as poetic artificiality, as a thoughtless mimicry of European forms. For Ventura García Calderón, the Peruvian Romantic generation, and I quote, wept because Lamartine and Musset had wept. Theirs was not a sincere sentiment, but a simple affectation. It was not, I quote, a state of the soul, but a literary pastime. Even by dying young, García Calderón famously insisted, Peruvian poets seemed to plagiarize the French, unquote. Such questionings build on notions of failed originality and the cultural alienation of Latin American elites that still dominate today. The painter's self-representation also suggests a more specific cause for this disposition. The key to this alternative source of melancholy is Laso's self-portrait in indigenous dress, for which he posed sometime after 1858. Here, sitting on the ground and wearing a poncho and chullo, his rueful self-image encounters its other, that of the melancholic Indian. There's a serious empathy in his adoption of the other's dress, one that touches on those larger narratives of cultural authenticity that displaced the poets of his generation to a secondary, derivative sphere, but also to the widespread discourses on the melancholic poetry and music of the indigenous song known as the Yaraví. This self-portrait is a crucial piece in a broader history of Creole approximations to the Indian, largely forged through the sadness that shapes the complex compositions known under the collective title of the Pascanas, a term designating resting places in the Andes. The interweaving of the literary, musical, and pictorial strands of indigenous melancholy allows us to study the master trope of modern indigenism as a cultural construct, through which I argue the modern image of the Indian came to be shaped. Lasso's Pascanas build on these ideas to create the scene of approximation. The three major paintings forming the sequence insistently explore this theme, so central to Lasso's pictorial project. The last in the series is a large canvas, which has come down to us as the Haravico, a title deriving from the chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, who in his royal commentaries defined the Haravicos as a poet, and I quote, who told of the deeds of their kings and other famous Incas and chief curacas in verse, and taught these poems to their descendants as a tradition, so that the good deeds of their ancestors should be remembered, unquote. The term gained popularity in 19th century literary circles as the ancient equivalent of modern poets. This still painting that suppresses all narrative is a painting about storytelling. Its title refers to the figure who sits on the far left and gestures as if speaking. His importance within the painting is subtly emphasized. He is seated upon a textile bundle that elevates him slightly above the rest, and his seniority is stressed by the presence of a walking rod beside him. Though the viewer cannot hear his voice, the title evokes the Haravico's poetry, from which the Yaraví derived. The general gravity that pervades the composition suggests that he is telling a tragic episode from their history. By mid-century, storytelling had become a central theme in intellectual circles, particularly among writers of La Revista de Lima, where Lasso collaborated. In 1859, the journal published an essay on Peruvian oral history by French diplomat René Tabouel, a text which expressed astonishment that no one should have thought of gathering, and I quote, those precious memories that are orally transmitted, and which are the chronicles of the youth of modern nations. Tabouel had no doubt that among the multitude of Indian legends, historians might discover among, and I quote, the poems disseminated in the mysterious valleys of Peru, something analogous to the Ionic epic, unquote. Yet there was, in fact, an emerging interest in oral traditions among the collaborators of the journal that was not expressed in the form of a rigorous ethnography. Contemporary literature was largely framed and defined by the idea of oral traditions, both in the tradición, the historical stories created by Ricardo Palma, as in the many of Juana Manuela Gorriti's Andean tales. Lasso himself undertook the representation of an oral tradition in one of his most ambitious works, a bizarre free-slide composition known as The Burial of the Priest, which is key for understanding the discourses of melancholy that dominated the Creole imagination, and which we will address before continuing with the Pascanas. The painting's very format evokes narrative development. The extended horizontal presents the movement of a funeral procession. There is a corpse led and flanked by monks, followed by a group of grieving Indians. The two glowing angels with flaming swords pave the way for this cortege, their swords of fire raised in defense as they go open the way. They march toward the threatening presence at the far left, where a group of devils dance around an open grave, or perhaps the mouth of hell, the source of a macabre reddish glow that illuminates this unnaturally dark area of the painting. The painting recalls that trend for paintings of rural processions presented to the Paris salons in the 1850s, and was early associated by the critic Teófilo Castillo with the Mancha y Puito, a widespread tale of prohibited love between a priest and a woman, which related the invention of the quena, the Indian flute that produced the sad Andean music. Lasso most likely drew on La Quena, a widely known story by Juana Manuela Gorriti, frequently reprinted in this period, which traced the origins of the flute to a priest's macabre gesture of singing the melodies with an instrument fabricated from his dead lover's femur. Unlike other versions, where the woman is the Indian victim of a white figure of authority, in Gorriti's tale, the situation is reversed. Rosa is the daughter of a powerful nobleman, and the priest, Hernán de Camporreal, the illegitimate son of a noble Spaniard and an Indian woman of Inca descent. romance allegorizes ethno-racial differences by alluding to the transgression of established hierarchies and to always fruitless desires, in which national unification is continually subverted by unlikely unions and their tragic outcomes. In Gorriti's tale, the story of the romantic origins of the lugubrious sound of the quena is framed by the story of the Indians' heroic resistance, a fight that would be financed by great treasures hidden in a secret underground city. For Campo Real has a double identity. He is also Chascanawi Inca, the name he adopts in the sacred covert races holding the treasure that he is to use to liberate his people from the Spanish yoke. Campo Real is not originally a priest, for he takes his vows only after being deceived by an evil rival into believing that Rosa has betrayed him. When he abducts Rosa's corpse, he takes her to his house, a palace built over the ancient ruins that hold the treasure and the promise for liberation. This would be the building that appears to the far left of the painting, here on the screen. The grieving Indians in Lasso's paintings can be seen as a nation grieving the death of their leader, and the scene no less than the burial of the last Inca. But if Lasso's painting is clearly indebted to Gorriti's story, the moment he chooses to represent the burial of the priest is absent from all known versions. An account recorded by Clements Markham in his travel through the southern Andes concludes with the image of the dead priest being carried away to hell by 3 demons, as do 20th century ethnographic records of tales of sinners being carried away by cars of fire. Lasso thus seems to combine the elements from various versions of this popular legend. One of the earliest versions of the story, appearing in an unpublished diary of 1848, recounts how the author was awakened by a haunting melancholic sound and, unable to resist its beckoning, rushed out into the dark streets of Arequipa to find a group of Indians playing the flute inside a vessel known as a pute, which gave it an even more lugubrious sound. Validated by the experience of direct personal contact with the indigenous informant, this account figures the Creole encounter with the Indian. This is the crux of these narratives, as the stories are cast not as original literary texts, but as transcriptions of indigenous legends. Gorriti, in fact, subtitles her story a Peruvian legend. Yet the indigenous origins of the narrative cannot be ascertained, and everything suggests that both the story and the mythical instrument it evokes are rather Creole creations that give shape to a local folklore, in which literary texts are conceived as creative individual interpretations of anonymous collective works. Literature thus provides a strategy that allowed urban intellectuals to participate in the collective creations of a people. Yet this Creole interest in indigenous culture confronted the obstacle of language. Though it had been known and used by elites during the colonial period, most urban intellectuals like Lasso no longer knew Quechua, and the abandonment of native languages was in fact considered almost a precondition for the incorporation of the indigenous population into the nation. As Manuel de Mendiburu proposed in 1874, writing on the poetic value of the Peruvian language, as he called it, the forced teaching of Spanish to the indigenous population was the only means of avoiding the situation of perpetuating, and I quote, 2 nations that look upon each other with mischance and disdain, the one very numerous and ignorant on the other side of the Cordillera, another that speaks for itself and by itself in the name of unity and national autonomy, unquote. Creole texts often reflect this awareness of Creole supremacy over both language and representation. Once a Manchaypuito entered the literary repertoire, it fostered a spate of repetitions. For this folklore to exist, it had to be paradoxically constituted as it passed from an oral to a literary tradition, from anonymous collective expression to the authority of the named individual voice, from the bounds of the vernacular to the logic of international bourgeois culture, or as Bauman and Briggs would claim, as they erected the binary structure of tradition and modernity. The Manchaypuito elaborated the ideal of ethnography, not by forging a discipline founded on fieldwork, but by materializing, perhaps for the first time, an ethnographic desire. As a tale of an impossible love between a Creole and an Indian, the Manchaypuito legend asserts the difference that separates these categories. Like the melancholic sentiment that unites the poet with nature, or which bridges the gap between urban intellectuals and the rural peasantry, the modern aesthetic field was itself constructed through its others, the imaginary and never fully present indigenous poets. As elites affirmed their inscription in international intellectual circuits, they produced a figure of indigenous culture. The antinomy of the high and the popular that characterized modernity was further grafted onto an ethno-racial divide. These narratives of communication came to be paradoxically fixed within another widespread stereotype. This is the book that compiled these texts, one of the books by Gorriti. So these narratives of communication are fix another stereotype, that of the inscrutable Indian who refuses to speak to the Creole. When in 1794, an anonymous author accused the editors of the journal Mercurio Peruano of returning always to the same topics, the editors responded that the limited scope was to be explained by the fact that it was difficult to have access to ancient monuments, given the mysterious prudence, and I quote, with which they are concealed by those who possess them, perhaps without benefit for themselves, unquote. These ideas that the Indians are the only rightful heirs of the pre-Columbian past and its archaeological remains, and that out of fear or egotism, they refuse to share their heritage with non-indigenous elites, and that they lack the ability to make their knowledge and properties productive, would be repeated and recreated obsessively. As the image of the insurmountable Andes had already become a symbol as a barrier to progress, the character of its inhabitants became a further impediment for the constitution of modern Peru. As a form of self-imposed exclusion, the Indian silence amounted to the creation of a space that resisted scientific description and ultimately the mapping of the nation. Elites thus transferred onto the indigenous population the fault for their own marginalization. It was they, not the Creole state, who was to be blamed for the separation. Some of the most best known and most widely disseminated stories of 19th century narratives of Inca gold, secretly guarded by the suffering Indians for the moment of liberation, served to perpetuate the stereotype of the inscrutable Indian. Gold inevitably evokes the conquest and the greed of the conquerors. In stories spun around this theme, the hidden treasures are part of the ransom offered to the Spaniards by Atahualpa, the last Inca, which the Indians hide upon hearing of his death, setting it aside for the collective project of liberation. The probity of the Indians, who rather than squander the treasure, choose to sacrifice personal riches in favor of a collective cause, contrasts with the greed motivating the conquerors and their descendants. When an Indian, through torture or seduction, betrays the secret, death and depredation immediately follow. Related stories tell how the Indians withheld their knowledge of rich mines to avoid ensuing exploitation as laborers. The implicit avowal of abuse leads to imaginings of revenge. In La Quena, Campo Real is charged by his mother to liberate his people, and I quote, not with hatred that would want the blood of their masters, but with enlightenment that will make them equal, unquote. These stories thus establish an apology for silence and a confession of guilt, a fear of rebellion and a muted belief in its justification. Gorriti subtly evokes these contradictory feelings of culpability and remorse. The moral high ground always rests with the indigenous population. Lasso himself, defending the Indian's character, wrote, and I quote, if in general, the Indian is cautious, avaricious, and ungrateful, it isn't because these bad qualities are organic to the indigenous race. In the same circumstances as our Indians, Caucasians would also be reserved. How could the Indian be expansive or happy when he is brutalized by authorities and masters, unquote. Approximation presupposes this inscrutable Indian. The image of treasure simultaneously evokes both the distance separating Creoles and Indians and the Creole desire for communication. Storytelling, the medium through which the separation is ideally to be resolved, also becomes a medium through which it is enacted. Hidden in deep underground caves and subterranean cities, the treasures become metaphors of darkness and concealment, of inaccessible knowledge and exclusion. The Indian, wrapped in romantic mystery, becomes a privileged object of Creole desire. In El Tesoro de los Incas, Gorriti asks, and I quote, What thoughts burn under the patient resignation with which they endure their misfortune? What is that secret, transmitted from generation to generation and so religiously guarded among the tatters of their misery? Learn their beautiful language and hear the stories of their long nights around the fire of their huts, and you will believe to hear the symbolic dirges of the exiles of Zion under the willows of Babylon, unquote. Gorriti creates the scene of approximation as a space where difference is simultaneously asserted and sublimated. Creole interest in oral traditions did not emphasize content. It was not as interested in specific indigenous knowledge as it was obsessed by the idea of contact. The Indian who speaks thus becomes a privileged figure in the Creole imagination. Texts by urban intellectuals are frequently framed as originating in the words of the Incas or their rightful heirs, the contemporary Indians. In 1824, Unanue, who had written about the distrustful and mysterious character of the Indian, offered an early demonstration of this rhetorical stratagem. Wandering through the ruins of Santa, the author is plagued by questions regarding the ancient monuments, and I quote, "The dead do not speak. In peoples of recent origin, oral traditions can fill the gaps of history. From the conquest of Peru until the present, a few generations are enough to form it. In these rustic places, men live long, and from father to sons, they recount the things of the past," unquote. In the middle of this thought, an elderly man, Indian man, appears and strikes up a dialogue with the author. The words Unanue attributes to his informant are but paraphrases from Garcilaso, yet they help frame his praise of the patriot armies and validate his opinions. A similar strategy is deployed in the frontispiece of the 1851 edition of Mariano Eduardo Rivero and Juan Diego de Chudy's Antigüedades Peruanas, in which a generic Inca extends his arm outward, pointing to a landscape in the distance. The frame limits our view of the landscape, but by also pointing to the title page, it represents Rivero's work as an extension of the Inca's words. This legitimating strategy is repeated on the title page of the album that accompanies the book, where bizarre reconstruction of the portal of the sun in Tiahuanaco serves as a frame for a series of Inca portraits. Below, an Indian man points to the banner bearing the title and the names of the authors. The theme reappears in one of the album's final illustrations, in which an Indian gestures towards a view of ancient ruins while addressing the traveler, who appears to listen attentively to his words. Gustavo Buntings has perceptively noted the crack separating the two figures, a detail emphasizing a distance that needs to be bridged. The Creole, who holds the privilege of communication with the Indian, becomes authorized to speak on the Indian's behalf. The contemporary Indian, heir of the Incas, becomes the intermediary between the Creole Republic and the pre-Columbian legacy. Elites act as ventriloquists, entitled to speak for the indigenous populations and for their history, an authority that would be reaffirmed as the modern disciplines of archaeology, philology, and anthropology consolidated over the following decades in spaces of knowledge far distant from those whose histories were being told. Lasso's Pascana series weaves together the different strands of Creole discourses of approximation and the emerging tropes of an idealized indigenous culture. They are apparently straightforward paintings, almost self-evident in their compositional clarity, yet they evoke the impression that they need to be deciphered. I suggest that these are performative pieces, that what we see is a dense synthesis of a complex pictorial process structured through the idea of Creole approximations to the Andean world. The Haravico's explicit reference to storytelling evokes not only Creole literary narratives, but also the contemporary European interest in oral traditions and the pictorial iconography that developed in its wake. Often set in rural landscapes, European images of storytelling built upon the longing for rural forms of life in the context of the rapid industrialization of the countryside. The Haravico evokes the sort of attentive, even pious listening present in contemporary French scenes of rural life. It reveals a similar nostalgia for the authenticity of traditional cultures that draws from the surge of peasant themes in the 1850s. It is not by chance that when shown in Paris in 1855, the French critics should have compared Lasso's Inhabitant of the Cordilleras to the peasants of Leopold Robert, or that the painting should have appeared on the same page of l'Illustration as a reproductive engraving of an anecdotal Bohemians Resting by Ludwig Naus, also shown at the Universal Exhibition, an event that gave new legitimacy to peasant themes. At the same exhibition, Rudolf Lehmann, another German student in Paris, presented a scene from Lamartine's Graziella, showing a group of Italian peasants attentively listening to the stories being read by the protagonists, a painting that more clearly evokes the compositional clarity of Lasso's Pascanas. The equivalence between different traditional cultures was inescapable at a moment when European painting undertook the larger project of establishing its modernity through the figuration of its others. Italian, Bohemian, and Peruvian peasants play a similar role in an international discourse built around a sequence of oppositions between orality and literacy, provincialism and cosmopolitanism, local and universal, that historically determined the very idea of modernity. Yet the painter's relationship of his subjects presupposes neither the relative cultural proximity of French or German artists to the peasantry, nor the vast geographic and cultural distance separating European artists from their Orientalist subjects. Lasso transforms and reframes European pictorial precedents. This difference becomes apparent through comparison to a major European painting of comparable subject, Horace Vernet's The Parliamentary and the Majluf, or Arab Chiefs in Council, first shown in 1834. The viewer is given immediate access to the scene, allowed to survey the landscape from a privileged position. The figures in the foreground do not sit in a closed circle, but leave an open space that serves as an entry point. The viewer looks through this empty space in the middle of the canvas, only to be guided to the figure of an Arab man who in turn looks behind him. It is difficult to focus on the main group. The broader composition, organized along two diagonals that seem to meet in the far horizon, serves as a sort of funnel, literally forcing the viewer to focus on the vast landscape in the background and the events that are taking place. None of the figures look out. Immersed in their activities, they are oblivious to the fact that they are being watched. Vernet deploys the illusion of transparency and the picturesque strategies that Linda Nochlin so cleanly described, and that allows the controlling gaze of the West to fix upon an exoticized and distant Orient. Lasso produced a painting that resists transparency. Favoring the broad definition of masses, he rejected the illusionism created by the excess of ethnographic details in Vernet's painting. He also constructed a scene that forefronts and complicates the place of the viewer. The Indians occupy almost the entire surface of the painting, effectively blocking the view of the landscape. The standing figure in the foreground has her back turned to the viewer, effectively deflecting the spectator's gaze. At the midpoint of a triangle formed by the slanting backs of the storyteller on the left and the figure on the other extreme, it also serves to anchor and unify the composition. But the imaginary sides of this triangle do not function as orthogonals. Rather, they run parallel to the picture surface, negating any indication of depth. The viewer is thus constantly forced to focus on the foreground rather than on the landscape behind. Depicted in strict profile, the storyteller in Lasso's Haravico clearly does not direct himself to the viewer. His audience is a group of Indians who sit in the same space, their heads tilted slightly downward, attentively concentrating on his words. He speaks to them, and he does so in a space, the Andean landscape, that had already been defined as distant and inaccessible. In denying from the outset an easy access to the scene, the painting resists the viewer's gaze and refuses to legitimate its narratives of mastery. Yet the composition does not block out the viewer entirely. The standing figure is placed slightly off-center to the left, so that the circle formed by the group of Indians is not completely closed. A space is left open, allowing a point of access to the scene. It is precisely at this point, on the right-hand side of the painting, that the viewer's gaze is met by that of an Indian woman, the only figure who's not entirely self-absorbed. She serves a crucial function within the painting. By acknowledging the viewer, she initiates the exchange around which the entire composition is structured. For it is her gaze that turns the spectator into a participant. Her signaling outward is what bridges the distance between the spectator and the scene represented in this painting. The open space is what we could call a constitutive blank, to borrow the notion that Wolfgang Kemp usefully introduced to art history from German resumption aesthetics, pointing to the constructive character of the carefully calculated discontinuities and the focused incompleteness of works that must necessarily be, and I quote, brought to completion in and through the beholder, unquote. Yet the viewer in Lasso's painting not only observes the scene, but is, in turn, observed in a way in which the power of the spectatorial gaze is actually reversed. The beholder here is clearly not a privileged, omniscient viewer, but rather a figure dependent on the gaze of the woman in the painting, who offers the only possibility of penetrating the mysterious composition. Yet her side glance is ambiguous, almost questioning. It functions more as an acknowledgement of the viewer than an invitation to the scene. Far from being in control, the beholder's place is determined by that outward gaze and by the organization of the painting, which further decenters her position, locating her in a marginal place within the represented scene. Lasso makes no effort to facilitate this imaginary exchange. The tense dialogue the painting establishes with the viewer forms the very essence of the composition and reveals the intentions and complexities of the Pascana series as a whole. The dialogic nature of the Haravico is fraught from its inception, starting from the evident fact that a pictorial representation of an oral narrative is necessarily silent. The viewer encountering the painting, taunted by the story being told, is however inevitably excluded by the very limitations of pictorial representation. That forced silence evokes and somehow replicates other limitations faced by elites in this imaginary encounter, determined by the nature of modern Peruvian society's fractured relationship with the indigenous population, and significantly by the barrier of language. A keen awareness of this division surfaces in contemporary texts, and Lasso's painting places the burden of language on non-indigenous viewers, who are put in the situation of encountering a conversation in which they cannot participate. Lasso's paintings evoke racial anxieties, collective feelings of guilt, political illegitimacy, and cultural inadequacy that plagued Creole leaders in their confrontation with Peru's indigenous population. The Pascana series is not only informed by this situation, but it is the nature of this relationship that forms its very purpose. The paintings literally create the scene of approximation, the site for a different kind of encounter between the non-indigenous viewer and an imaginary Andean world. Approximation also structures the process through which the Pascanas were conceived. Key to understanding the progression and development of the series is a sequence of exceptional photographs that Lasso used to compose the Haravico. We know little about these images, taken sometime after Lasso's return from his second trip to Europe. They were likely produced no earlier than 1857, when the wet collodion process used in their making became generalized in Peru. Furthermore, there is no information regarding the photographer's name nor the place where they were made. Clearly, Lasso himself must have posed models and selected the dresses, but considering the expertise required to produce wet collodion negatives, it is unlikely that he would have taken the photographs himself. The subjects were posed on a makeshift stage formed by the precarious placement of wooden boards on top of forged metal furniture. A simple blank cloth hangs behind. The setting seems to be an urban location, and the intense contrast of the shadows suggests that they are not in Lima, but perhaps in Arequipa, during Lasso's extended stay in that city in 1857. The urban setting would explain the selective use of non-indigenous models, though the very ambiguity of racial designations, which I explore elsewhere, necessarily complicates the ethnic identification of many of the figures posing for the painter. These photographs operate as a sort of fragmented scene, posed and acted out to be later projected onto the pictorial stage. Lasso's method perhaps explains why the stillness of his compositions rather evokes the motionless pause of the tableau vivant than the arrested movement of the photographic instant. The correspondence between the studies and the figures in the final painting reveals that Laso had already decided on the general arrangement of the composition before the photographs were taken. They seem to take place of the usual preliminary drawings and possibly preceded the oil sketch, now in the collection of the Museo de Arte de Lima, in which Laso regrouped the figures in the photographs to give shape to a unified composition. Save for a few changes, such as the significant replacement of the oxen in the background for llamas and the use of a lighter palette, the final version of the painting closely follows the sketch. The direct relationship between the preparatory studies and the final work points to the importance of both the existence of the photograph of Laso in indigenous dress and its crucial omission from the sketch and from the painting. By excluding himself, Laso allowed the opening on the right-hand side of the painting, where the viewer is clearly situated. The painter takes on the role of the beholder to mediate both the viewer's position and her access to the scene. The Haravico is thus the final product of a longer process through which Laso worked out the problem of establishing forms of contact between the beholder and the scene represented in the painting. Although none of the works in the Pascana series can be firmly dated, there is evidence that can help establish a relative chronology. Ugartelespuru described the unfinished Indian encampment in the Banco Central de Reserva as a large sketch, a characterization which cannot be taken literally, but which points to the fact that it seems to have served as a point of departure for the series. Dated studies allow us to place the conception of the painting shortly after Laso's first return from Europe in the early 1850s. The tentative quality of the composition, where many of the figures are broadly brushed in and extensive areas remain undefined, suggesting that it was never finished. The Pascana in the Cordillera seems to have been created in the late 50s, after the Indian encampment and before the Haravico, which would be the last work in the series, traditionally assigned to 1868, which can be confirmed by Laso's appearance in the photograph. A later date could also explain the imprecision of the landscape in the background, if we imagine that perhaps Laso's death in mid-1869 interrupted completion of the painting. The Indian encampment, Laso's first exploration of the subject, is the only painting in the series for which numerous preparatory drawings and sketches survive. The central figure, a woman spinning, is based on studies Laso made during a trip to southern Peru in 1849. The image of a man carrying a load uphill to the right is also based on an undated preparatory drawing at the Museo de Arte de Lima. Other studies reveal Laso exploring alternative compositions, some organized around the figure of a man playing music with a quena. A more finished study, arranged in an elongated format, develops the main groups that are present in the final painting. The relaxed sense of community of the mute conversation presented in the canvas suggests Laso first conceived the scene as an idyllic and idealized Andean pastoral. The solemnity and contrived arrangement of the figures in the final version of the composition point to a different conception. There is a clear evocation of Jean-Francois Millet's Harvester Resting, which Laso could have seen exhibited at the 1853 Salon. The paintings, cast in golden tones, depict a similar arrangement of figures grouped around a meal. The biblical title that Millet originally gave his painting, Ruth and Boaz, reveals an intention to elevate peasant subjects through the resources of historical painting. Yet Laso's final composition marks a departure from European representations of European subjects. The Indian encampment includes a figure that transforms the composition, suggesting that the issue of approximation was already at the center of Laso's program. Sitting among the main group in the foreground at the very center of the canvas is a figure dressed in a simple poncho with his back to the spectator. His tightly cut hair contrasts sharply with that of the rest of the figures, as it does not seem to correspond to the image of the painting's indigenous subjects, who are identified by hat or by the arrangement of their hair in thick black tufts or braids. Though the fact that this figure turns his back to us makes any definite identification impossible, both the cut and the overall shape and turn of the head recalls Laso's self-portrait of 1851. The figure's ambiguous identity does not allow him to be fully identified, yet the fact that it could be a non-Indian evokes the issue of approximation, and the veiled personal references show Lasso struggling to find ways of framing an encounter, though there is yet no obvious attempt to engage the viewer in this quest. The Pascana in the Cordillera, clearly the next painting in the series, directly derives from both the disposition of and the gestures of the three figures in the background of the Indian encampment and other sketches made for that painting. These three figures become the center of the Pascana in the Cordillera, where they acquire a new monumentality. Filling the entire frame of the painting, they are pushed to the foreground and confined to a dramatically compressed pictorial space. The viewer is confronted by the massive life-size figures that form an almost monolithic barrier, one that obstructs access to the landscape. The composition at once translates and contests elite visions of the Andes as an impediment to the nation's material progress and to their mastery over the land. The viewer's low eye level negates the surveyor's gaze. The effect on the viewer is an overwhelming sense of displacement and even subjection. Yet the composition also opens up a space that establishes the final dialogic intent and strategies that Lasso was to deploy in the Haravico. Here too, the viewer is placed on a slightly off-center axis and the entry to the painting mediated by an outward glance of the crouching figure to the right. His face is barely visible, partly covered by the folded arm, partly hidden in the shadows cast by the hat, so that the viewer cannot distinguish the nature of this outward gaze, which is nonetheless confrontational. The presence of the pre-Columbian ceramic of a bound figure that Lasso had already used in the inhabitant of the Cordilleras to represent the Indians' oppression here appears in an even more broken and ruinous state. It evokes one of the central subtexts of the painting, that of an Indian memory marked and defined by the conquest, a dualistic history in which Creoles are figured as heirs of the conquerors. These paintings recreate the simultaneous movement of approximation and distancing implicit in Creole representations of communication. Although in the Indian encampment, Lasso created a more distant scene. In the Pascana and the Cordilleras, he pushed the figures aggressively to the foreground in a way that almost seems to invade the viewer's space, making their presence both impossible to dominate or to avoid. This confrontation is more subtly managed in the Haravico, where Lasso created an imaginary space for the viewer, is more openly interpolated. Seen as a sequence, Lasso's Pascana series reveals a process of exploration of ways of engaging and involving the viewer. The complex construction of this address, which has few parallels in contemporary painting, reveals a profound thinking through of both pictorial practice and the ethical import of a national art. Each work frames a partial solution to a similar problem, turning the surface of the painting into a stage that actively constructs and enables an approximation to the Andean world. I have presupposed a Creole viewer, and there is no doubt that the paintings were intended for the intellectual circles of the capital, the context in which they were created, first exhibited, and discussed. In rejecting colonial traditions and reframing the status of art, Lasso's generation also undermined the social foundations on which pictorial practice had been grounded. Painting became a privileged and even aristocratic profession, which made it a marginal practice in Peruvian society. Lasso's generation envisaged an informed public as the outcome of a long process, the results of which only future generations of Peruvians would see. The difficulties Lasso imposed on viewers of his paintings, demanding of them both will and effort to engage with his Indian subjects, suggest that he envisaged this ideal spectator, a citizen of a future and more enlightened society. In 1860, Lasso wrote, and I quote, "Such is the essence of the Indian's goodness, that he knows how to be grateful when he finds some superior being who shows him consideration. There are 1,000 deeds of gratitude on the part of the Indian towards their protectors. In what province is it not told that such and such a man has become rich because an Indian friend disclosed a treasure?" Unquote. Lasso's paternalistic invocation appeals to individual feelings of one of those superior beings. And if the Pascanas suggest the possibility of communication, their effect ultimately depends on the willingness of the Creole viewer to participate in the exchange. The extent to which this ambiguous invitation was heeded is difficult to assess. The only contemporary reference to these paintings is as brief as it is telling. Reviewing the 1861 exhibition of the Pascana in the Cordillera, An anonymous critic simply wrote that Lasso's painting, I quote, will always be retained by amateurs as a most faithful reproduction of a mute scene of our poor natives, unquote. We could suggest that the ideal viewer of Lasso's Pascanas is none other than the painter himself. Not, however, in the generic understanding of the artist as first beholder of the works, unless in the sort of bodily merger that Michael Fried imagines in his interpretation of Courbet's relation to his own paintings. The veiled biographical references in this complex series are largely invisible to the spectator, but as in other works by Lasso, these personal projections purposefully structure the conception of the paintings. The photographic studies for the Haravico involve him in the Indians' conversation, yet the photographs also betray their staged nature. This is not a group found in the Andean highlands, but figures that have been posed, some perhaps also even clothed in borrowed dress. Lasso is not the only non-Indian in this sequence. At least one other unidentified friend, his face lowered and hidden under an industrial striped cloth, transformed into an Andean woven textile in the painting, also figures in a photograph, though he does not actually wear the indigenous garments, but has them thrown over his own clothes. In the painting, his face is barely visible under the cloth covering his head. His presence unsettles more evident readings, while at the same time, it effectively realizes the incorporation of the Creole into the Andean conversation. Lasso builds his public allegories through personal narratives that transform the practice of painting into a site of redemption. Yet the artist's gestures are determined by previous traditions of Creole approximations, by prevailing stereotypes of the Indian, and above all, by the complex and ambiguous way in which elites redefine them within the imaginary bounds of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. So we have some time for questions. If you have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A, use the Q&A function you should see on the bottom of your screen, and they will be hopefully visible to us. Well, while we're waiting for a question to come in, I'll take the opportunity to ask a first one, if you don't mind, Natalia.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, and this is just a very broad general question, to what extent you see this metaphor of approximation. Well, perhaps it's more than a metaphor, that you're structuring the kind of encounter between the Creole world and the indigenous one in this moment. Do you think that this is restricted to this kind of 19th century moment, or does this also work for, maybe the better known 1920s moment of indigenism? Do you think that that idea of approximation continues to work? Does it change?
Well, I think one of the things that is very striking to somebody who is acquainted with 20th century indigenous discourse, when you turn to the 19th century, is seeing the very marked continuities that are to be found in the stereotypes, the images, and the rhetorical strategies of indigenism in general. So, in fact, the idea of the melancholic Indian continues to be a very powerful one throughout the 20th century and even today. The notion of distance, the notion of a separate culture. This is also crucial. In the short space of a lecture, I could not expand on the notion of the indigenous as a bound culture fixed to a particular geography, for example, which is also a very important element in the construction of these paintings. So yes, I would say that there are, in fact, greater continuities than is imagined, because usually, at least in Peru, modern indigenism, the first inklings of modern indigenism are traced to the post-war period, to the period after the war of the Pacific, where supposedly intellectuals reflected upon the need to incorporate the indigenous population into the nation, when in fact, many of those post-war debates and discourses had been prefigured already by Lasso's intellectual generation.
Super interesting. Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So if you don't, I'll go ahead and read them. So the first is, I'm curious about something not necessarily related to Peru. Are there ways of explaining artists who consistently, even obsessively, paint their own face onto portraits? I'm thinking less of Lasso than of the Brazilian painter Pedro Américo.
Well, it's a very broad question. I don't know if I can answer that. But for example, the whole notion, the way I could bring it all together, I would say is, of course, the very rapid insertion of artistic production in what is now commonly defined as the modern system of the arts, and romantic notions of the artist as a sort of exalted individual. So yes, I mean, one of the things that is very clear is just the impressive amount of self-portraits that we have for the 19th century compared to any other period in Latin American art, either before or after the 19th century. So there is a very clear emergence of a conscience of the artist's importance and the artist's personal identity also as a clear marker of artistic production. So yes, the artist does acquire a new importance here in these discussions.
Okay, we have another question from Horacio. He asks, could you say a bit more about what you mean by the performative aspect of the paintings? Is it linked to the artist's personal relationship to the images as a Criollo interested in racial tensions, or to the painting's link to photography and people posing for the camera?
I think you could claim both. And I think you have a third option even, which is that the experience of viewing the painting, a successful viewing of the painting would imply an approximation to the indigenous. So you have these three levels, I think, in which you could say these are performative works. But I think that Horacio's question suggests ways in which I could clarify that further.
Here's another one. Okay. Diane asks, in the Andes scene from the city, Efrain Cristal argues that literary indigenismo was usually, or maybe always, a use of the Andes as a way to say something about urban coastal politics. Could your interpretations of Lasso be framed in this way as well?
Very good question. No, definitely no. I don't think so, because my definition, and this again is, unfortunately, the kind of thing one cannot go into in a presentation such as this. But my definition of indigenism, in fact, depends on a different take, which is to argue that indigenism in its modern version is a cultural discourse. It is a discourse about culture, and it transforms the figure of the Indian into a cultural object, if you wish. Cristal tries to trace very direct links of the ways coastal writers write about the Andes. It's a very interesting and very pioneering book that I have read with great pleasure. But at the same time, I find that on the one hand, the kind of direct links that he makes are not necessarily, don't necessarily correlate so precisely to specific political positions in the 19th century. But I would also say, and I think this would be my main response, that actually it's a different sort of discourse. Even though modern indigenism can, of course, incorporate a political perspective, I would argue that even in a person like Mariátegui, it is essentially a cultural discourse.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Okay, here's another one that just came in. Sean Austin asks, I'm hoping you could elaborate more on the role of archaeology in the presence of ancient Andean ceramics in Lasso's work. Can you elaborate more on the repetitive use of captive figures in the ceramics?
Yes, that's also a very interesting question, also one that I cannot explore in this text, but what I would say is that ceramic is very clearly tied to one of the most constant and ever-present discourses on the Indian, which is, of course, the idea of the Indian as victim. This is a very old discursive strand that can be traced to the 16th century, and there are people who have written about the use of the notion of the miserable Indian race in, for example, colonial law. But in the 19th century acquires a new nuances. What Lasso does with that, however, is use it as what I would consider a visual stratagem to avoid creating the image of the dejected Indian. See, if violence and the bound captive against the bound captive is figured through an archaeological object, it need not affect the modern Indian. So Lasso's desire to ennoble his indigenous figures, I think, has much to do with that.
Just while we wait to see if any other questions come in, can I ask a quick follow-up on that, which is, where would he have had access to figures like that to draw from? Like, what collections would he have found those kind of ceramics in at the time?
Actually, in a lot of places, as Stephanie Gainger's work on 19th century collecting has shown, there were numerous collections. For example, he had visited Cusco. There were already some private museums in Cusco. He had close connections to many collectors in Lima and in Paris. There is evidence that one very similar piece was in a private collection in Paris to which he had access. One could even surmise perhaps his own. But there is, the 1850s is a moment of great resurgence of pre-Columbian, of a concern, of an elite concern with pre-Columbian antiquities, basically spurred by Rivero's Antigüedades Peruanas, which is this very important contribution.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then we can wrap it up here. And I just want to encourage you all to be on the lookout for Natalia's book when it comes out in the next couple of weeks. And thank you all for attending today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.